chapter book, which incidentally, when you break it up by sections, this is one of those books where the chapter divisions are, for the most part, pretty good. Sometimes the chapter divisions don't always catch the train of thought and the flow, but this is one of those where it's really good. There in Ruth chapter 1 and verse 1, it tells us that it happened in the time of the judges. So it's the best of times. It's being pretty much anything and everything other than God. And that had consequences, and we talked about the downhill spiral there in the book of Judges. But it's in the time of the judges that this short book happens. And what's interesting is that in this dark time, in this worst of times for the people of Israel, one of the things that we're going to see in this book, I don't want to spoil the surprise, but I am going to let you know that one of the things that we're going to see is how God is still working. God is still working to advance His plan of redemption. This story will tell us how we go from the judges to David. And so just real quickly, go back in our minds for those of us who were here last week, how we talked last week there in Judges chapter 1, I believe it's Judges chapter 20. Judges begins and ends by saying, who will go for us? Who will lead us? And the answer both times at the beginning and the end of Judges is Judah. That the book of Judges is setting up the story of David. And now here in Ruth, it kind of fleshes that out. It connects some dots there in the text. And so as we start this morning, as you were reading the book of Ruth this week, what concepts and themes or even lessons or applications did you notice when we were reading the book of Ruth? What jumped off the page to you?
So not necessarily anything in particular, but so this is set pretty much probably right where in the middle of the book.
Yeah.
And the book of Judges is just a rotten time in the history of Israel. Horrible time. But Ruth kind of is this little ray of light of what of God's grace and God's goodness in right in the middle of this horrible time period.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point to make, that Ruth, almost said Rahab, because Ruth and Rahab are related by marriage. But Ruth is this ray of light. In fact, just going to let you know, next Sunday we're going to look at another ray of light that takes place in the book of Judges. So even in this dark time, even as bad or ungodly as Israel was, one of the things we're going to see is there was still a glimmer of hope. There was still a beacon of light going out. Yes. And then
one of the things stuck out in my mind was how Ruth, when she made a commitment to God and her loyalty, she went in 100% as opposed to the other daughter-in-law.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I did read a commentary on this to get this point across. It's kind of like for us as Christians, some people become a Christian and to test out the waters if they like it, and then they fade off.
Yeah.
That would be like the other daughter that went back.
Yeah.
Ruth, in chapter 1, in verse 16 and 17, she's holy, your God is my God, and she went 100% in and stuff.
That Ruth 1, 16 and 17, you guys have heard me say a couple of times in our study together that this is a thesis statement for the book. I think in many ways Ruth 1, 16 and 17 is a thesis statement for the book of Ruth to tell us about her character. And we're going to dive a little deeper into that verse in just a second when we get going. So hold that thought, hold that train of thought. If I overlook it in a second, call me out and let me know, because there's some really incredible things there. Yes, Rob, and then Steve.
So, again, read this book. This is one of my favorite books in the Bible,
Yeah.
actually. But Naomi, I think it's interesting as far as her situation, her, don't call me Naomi,
Yep.
call me Mara, and then the redemption happens after that. But we go through tough times, and things happen in God's own time. And she's blessed in the end.
Yeah. There is a interesting, interesting theme that you see in the book of Ruth in Naomi's, as we would say today in a movie or a TV show or a book, character development. That she goes from this very bitter, barren woman at the beginning of this book to a very blessed woman at the end, and recognizing her blessings there at the end. Steve.
So, whenever I read this book, it seems to me that this just as easily could have been called the Book of Boaz.
Yeah. Yeah.
Rather than the Book of Ruth.
Yeah.
Because it seems to me that we see laid in front of us almost a model or a vision of the all-encompassing care that God is for us in the way that Boaz arrives on the scene. You can almost hear this covenant relationship language pouring out of this book, it seems to me.
And especially, it's not you can almost see it. I think you can see it. There in verse 8, real quickly, may the Lord show kindness. Anybody have a different translation there? Mine says kindness. You may have loving kindness or something like that, steadfast love. That word there is the word that is often translated steadfast love or faithful love or loving kindness, talking about God's love and God's care for his people, that covenantal love. And so, yeah, Hesed, I think I'm pronouncing it right, with a little southern drawl, of course. But that idea is very much present in the book of Ruth, how God is still faithful to his promises, even when Israel is not faithful. It is very much present in the book. Any other things that you guys noticed there in the book of Ruth before we dive in a little deeper? Okay, let's go in. Let's dive in there in the Ruth chapter 1 in verse 1. That it tells us there in the text that during the time of the judges, there was a famine in the land. Now that should tell us something, because if we go back in our minds to Deuteronomy and the blessings and the curses, one of the curses for their sins, one of the curses for rejecting God, was that there would be a famine in the land. So this tells us this is one of those downhill spirals. I think whoever said it earlier, I'm sorry for forgetting who said this, that Ruth probably takes place right smack dab in the chronological middle of the period of the judges. There's this famine, and a man left Bethlehem. Now this is fun. Do y'all know what the word Bethlehem means? In Hebrew? It means house of bread. So what is Ruth 1:1 telling us? That there is a famine in Bethlehem. There is no bread in the house of bread. And so this man with his wife and his 2 sons left to go stay in the territory of Moab for a while. And the man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. Great names, by the way. They were Ephraimites from Bethlehem. Now, go back in our minds. What did we read about in Judges 17 through 21? That right in their own eyes, but there is these stories that take place right at the end of Judges involving some Ephraimites, that there were people in the land in the hill country of Ephraim. And now we're reading about some people who live or are from that's Ephrathah, not Ephraim. I'm sorry, forget that. Never mind. They entered the fields of Moab and settled there. Naomi's husband Elimelech died, and she was left there with her 2 sons. Her 2 sons took Moabite women as their wives. One was named Orpah, and the second was named Ruth. And they lived in Moab about 10 years. But both Mahlon and Chilion died. And the woman was left without her 2 children and without her husband. So let's look there at verses 1 through 5 and think about this question. What does Elimelech do in those first 5 verses, and how does it affect his family? Especially maybe zoom out and think about the context. Who is Moab? Biblically speaking, who is Moab? I think they're descendants of Lot. I think you're correct there. They're descendants of Lot. The children of Israel are explicitly told, don't marry them, don't make covenants with them, avoid them at all costs, and yet what do we see this family doing? Marrying them. Not only just marrying them, they're living among them. That things are so bad in Israel that this family is forced to leave Israel to go live among these pagans who they were told by God, don't go to, don't marry, don't spend time with. And how does it affect his family? They marry, but yes, what else? What happens to his sons? What happens to him? They die. The text does not explicitly tell us, but I wonder if there may be some consequences for that. Again, I'm just throwing it out there for you to kind of chew on as they violate God's word. Is this a consequence of that sin, that transgression, and going beyond what God wants? And so there in verse 5, you have a widow and her 2 daughters-in-laws who are also widows. They are hopeless. To be a widow in the ancient world, there was no Social Security, there was no Medicare, there was no Medicaid, there was no 401k or pension or anything like that. To be a widow in the ancient world was a hopeless situation. You had no political power, no social status. Everything went wrong and is going wrong for this family. And then she, that is Naomi in verse 6, and her daughters-in-law set out to return from the territory of Moab because she had heard in Moab that the Lord had paid attention to his people's need by providing them food. She left a place where she had been living, accompanied by her 2 daughters-in-laws, and traveled along the road leading back to the land of Judah. And somewhere along the way, there in verse 8, Naomi said to them, each of you go back to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown kindness to the dead and me. May the Lord grant each of you rest in the house of a new husband. And she kissed them, and they wept loudly. And they said to her in verse 10, we insist on returning to you and your people. And Naomi replied, return home, my daughters. Why do you want to go with me? Am I able to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. Go on, for I am too old to have another husband. And even if I thought there was still hope for me to have a husband tonight and to bear sons, would you be willing to wait for them to grow up? Would you restrain yourselves from marrying? No, my daughters, my life is too bitter, or too much bitter, for you to share, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. And again they wept loudly. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. What's interesting is there in verse 14, the word translated clung or cleaved, depending on your translation, is the same word used to describe the husband-wife relationship in Genesis 2. Cleave, you're attached together. Ruth is like, I ain't leaving. I'm staying right next to you. Yeah, right.
So I just want to ask a quick question about this. When you're going to return to Judah, okay? And what do you make of this? For she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out away from the food.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm like, is that kind of the scripture's way of telling us why they were there to begin with?
Yeah, they had left Judah. They had left it to find food in Moab, and now that there's food back in Israel, they're going back home.
Okay.
They're
It's kind of funny that you would. It's
yeah.
kind of like in the story of Elimelech.
Yeah.
You should have kind of put that verse there.
Yeah. Yeah, but
Because there's food there.
yeah, they left Judah to find food in Moab. Now, after 10 years there, the Lord had answered their cry and is now providing food, so they're going home. And I think that's one of the struggles for us in some of these stories, especially to like the patriarchs, as they wander around looking for food and looking for provision and looking at the green grass, because we're not as agrarian and we don't necessarily migrate as much as they did. But that's what they're doing. They're just going where the food is because they've got to find food. You want to put food on your table, whether it's bread or whatever. You want food, yeah. Yeah, yeah. And we're going to see that idea play out in Ruth chapter 2, the idea of gleaning the corners of the field and all that kind of stuff. But if there's a famine in the land, the way I read that at least, is there's no crops. There's no food. And so there's no corners of the field to glean. There's nothing. Like, there's no tomato plants. There's no grain. There's no barley. There's no nothing. And so they're forced to do the unthinkable and cross over. That's the way I read it. But there in the text, you see Ruth is clung to Naomi. It's that they are so close, they're not leaving each other. And Naomi makes one more entreaty there in verse 15. Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Follow your sister-in-law. But Ruth replied, don't plead with me to abandon you or to return and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me, and do so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. One of the interesting things I see when you look at Joshua, and more specifically Rahab in the book of Joshua, and Ruth in the book of Ruth, as you have an example or examples of Israelites becoming Canaanites, becoming pagans, acting like pagans, Achan, and Canaanites, pagans, becoming and acting more like the people of God. That is Rahab and her faith. Here in Ruth, you see Elimelech and his family acting kind of more like pagans by going to associate with pagans in violation of God's law. And even there in verse 15, what does Naomi say? Go back to your gods. Like, Naomi, on one hand, recognizes the one true God, but also kind of recognizes Moab's gods. That she doesn't have a full picture, perhaps, of God as the one true God. And yet Ruth shows more devotion to the one true God than Naomi does. That's interesting. That Canaanites, that pagans, that Moabites are more devoted to the one true God than God's own people are. And so on that question, we've actually answered the second question, which is, how does Ruth demonstrate her loyalty? Well, she sticks next to Naomi. And they make the journey back to Israel together. And when they get to Bethlehem, the whole town is excited about their revival. And the local women exclaimed in verse 19, can this be Naomi? And Naomi says, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara. For the Almighty has made me very bitter. I went away full. I went away with sons, and I went away with a husband. But the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has opposed me, and the Almighty has afflicted me? And so Naomi came back from the territory of Moab with her daughter-in-law Ruth the Moabitess. And they arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Any thoughts, comments, or questions on Ruth chapter 1? So in Ruth chapter 2, it's the beginning of the barley harvest when they get back home. And Naomi knows that there's a relative on her side that is a prominent man, verse 1, of noble character from Elimelech's family. And his name was Boaz. Keep that phrase, noble character, in your mind. We're going to see it again in just a chapter. And so Ruth the Moabitess asked Naomi, will you let me go into the fields and gather fallen grain behind someone with whom I find favor? Naomi answers, go ahead, my daughter. And so Ruth entered the field to gather grain behind the harvesters. And she happened. That is interesting language to me. Because the writer of this book, whoever it may be, seems to be setting it up that this is all by complete and total chance. But for those of us who believe in God and believe in the power of God and believe in the providence of God, it seems to us as we're reading this book that this is not just by complete and total chance. Like Ruth does not hit the lottery when she walks into the field. This is God and His power and His providence setting things up to turn barrenness into hope. And so she's working in Boaz's field. And later in verse 4, when Boaz arrived from Bethlehem, he said to the harvesters, the Lord be with you. The Lord bless you, they replied. That Boaz is this man of noble character, and he seems to, even in this dark period of time, still be a godly man despite all the outside influences that he is dealing with in the world at that time. And in verse 5, he comes up to the people, and his servants, and goes, okay, who's that young woman over there? I have never seen her before. What's she doing in my field? Where's she from? Who's she with? What do we know about her? And the servant answered, she's the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the territory of Moab. And she asked, will you let me gather fallen grain among the bundles behind the harvesters? And she came, and she has been on her feet since early morning. She's a hard worker. She's doing what she can to provide for herself and her mother-in-law. Except for just a second, she did rest a little bit in the shelter. And then Boaz said to Ruth, listen, my daughter, don't go and gather grain in another field, and don't leave this one, but stay here close to my female servants. My female servants will protect you. And see which field they are harvesting and follow them. Haven't I ordered the young men not to touch you? When you are thirsty, go and drink from the jars that the young men have filled. And in verse 10, she fell face down, bowed to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor with you, so that you notice me, although I am a foreigner? Once again in the biblical story, we are seeing how God has a plan for the nations. God has a plan for the foreigners, that these foreigners, whether it's the Canaanites in Ruth, whether it's Canaanites in Rahab, the Moabites in Ruth, or even going a little farther back to the Exodus, we have a mixed multitude coming up of the land of Egypt. God has had a plan for the nations, and once again, we're seeing that she recognizes this is weird. I'm a foreigner. You shouldn't be showing kindness to me, but He is. We're going to see in this story once again foreigners being grafted in to the people of God. And Boaz answered there in verse 11, everything you have done for your mother-in-law since your husband's death has been fully reported to me. How you left your mother and father and your native land, and how you came to a people you didn't previously know. May the Lord, verse 12, reward you for what you have done, and may you receive a full reward from the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have fled for refuge. Okay. So what does Ruth's decision there in the first 12 verses of chapter 2 tell us about her character and faith? What does Ruth's decision to reflect, or to glean in the fields, reflect her character and faith?
First, it shows how she's humble or humility to go out there and glean in the field.
100%. She's humble. That would be hard work. Does anybody here want to go out and glean and work in the field, especially in the heat of the day? She's humble. She's a hard worker. Yeah, what else?
You mentioned it already, that
Yeah.
And so her willingness to go and do this work and actually provide subsistence for Naomi
Yeah.
spoke again to her love and character.
Yeah. Go back to chapter 1. I'm going to be with you. Where you go, I'm going to go. We're going to cling together. She is going to provide for her mother-in-law. That speaks to her character. She's going to make sure her family's taken care of. What else do you notice? Her courage. How so? Yeah. 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 It would be a scary thing to go into somebody else's field, even though that might be the culture at the time. Let's pause for a second. It's the period of the Judges. Let's not forget that, where everything goes. So I'm really, really curious, and it's my opinion, that not everybody in the period of Judges was following those Old Testament laws about letting the poor glean. It's my opinion. When you look at the character of the people in the period of the Judges, that seems to be on par for the course. So it's a lot of courage for her to go in a field, not knowing if she would be accepted or not, to work. And not only that, she's going into a field not knowing if there would be food, enough food to make it worth her while. There's a lot we can learn from her there in the text. I love the language there in verse 12. Under whose wings you have come for refuge. That is a concept, that is an idea, that is a picture that we see throughout the Bible of people who come to God in a period of crisis. That if you look at the Psalms in particular, you have several Psalms who will use a similar image for God's people who are running to God and seeking God in a time of crisis and great difficulty for their people. And you see Boaz kind of connect that in Ruth and what she is doing in her life. Yeah.
So I love the fact that Stephen said this book could easily be called the Book of Boaz. And maybe it's just me and how, as a young man, I've always looked at this Boaz's reaction to Ruth and thought, wow, Ruth must have been just an absolute smoke show. She had to have been a beautiful woman, because when you're a young man, that would get your attention.
Yeah.
Boaz is not a young man.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, he may not even live to see the birth of his child.
Yeah.
So, my point is, what is it then that made him take Ruth in? And you already said it. It is his character. Everything he does for Ruth and Naomi is just because his character drives him to be that person.
And that's the incredible thing about the story of Ruth. Again, bringing out the idea of the dark time of the Judges spiritually. As you see two people of noble character in Ruth and Boaz, who are seemingly providentially brought together by God to accomplish His saving purpose. You see in Boaz here in the text, especially as the story goes on into chapter 3, that Boaz seems to not only be an older guy, I think I agree with you that he's not a spring chicken, we'll just put it that way. And he's fairly wealthy. So in that day, in that age, having servants and fields and all that stuff and all the wealth, he would have attracted a lot of attention from the single ladies. All the single ladies would have loved him. But he seems to be looking for a woman of noble character for a spouse. And I'll throw a note out here that I find really, really, really interesting, just for thought. In the Hebrew Bible, the way the Jews have organized their Bible, Ruth follows Proverbs 31. That great chapter of the noble woman is followed immediately by this book about this noble woman, which I find interesting. This story, it was Rob who brought it up a moment ago. He just loves the book of Ruth. I like it too. Like, we're in a section of the Old Testament, I don't know if you can tell, that I just absolutely love. Joshua and Judges and Ruth and 1 Samuel is just really, really fun. Because you see so many like storylines and people, and especially here, as Todd has brought out, people of noble character who are taken care of by God. And so Ruth and Boaz have this dialogue, and Ruth goes back home that day and has this truckload of food there in the text. She comes home with 26 quarts of barley. That's a lot of barley. And her mother-in-law sees it there in verse 19 and goes, "Where in the world did you gather barley today? May the Lord bless the man who noticed you." And Ruth told her mother-in-law, whom she had worked with, and said, "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz." Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May the Lord bless him, because he has not abandoned his kindness to the living or the dead." Neon lights start going off because she understands what this means. She understands the possibility. She understands the covenant. And she understands there at the last part of verse 20 that this man is a close relative. He is one of our family redeemers. And this is why what Steve and Rob have highlighted, I think, is so interesting that this book could be called the Book of Boaz. Because in some ways, Boaz is the hero. In some ways, Boaz is the redeemer that they're looking for. So pause on that and chew on that as we work our way through the field. And so what have we already learned about Boaz's character to this point? We've been dancing around it. We've talked about it already, that he's a man of noble character. But do you guys notice anything else in your reading of Ruth in the last week about Boaz's character?
I like how he greets the reapers.
Yeah.
And he says, "May the Lord be with you," and
Yeah.
say in response, "The Lord bless you." So again, this is one of those examples of, yes, the time of Judges was very difficult and people were doing their own thing, but there were also those, like Boaz, that were still a remnant that were faithful to God.
I think you're right. Boaz is an example of a righteous remnant. And the way he treats the people working for him seems to be one of genuine love and care and concern. That this seems to be a man who's not only righteous in his conduct, but loving in his heart.
The fact that Ruth was a Moabite, right?
Yeah.
They weren't supposed to associate with that.
Yeah.
And he's like, puts that aside and knows he's strictly looking at her character,
Yeah.
not where she
And that's an interesting thing to highlight, because he demonstrates in this text what it really means to love your neighbor, to care for your neighbor. He puts aside the race and sees a woman in need who's doing what she can according to the covenant to provide for her family. And he goes above and beyond to make sure that she's provided for. I think this is a great comment. You guys notice anything else about Boaz's character?
Well, he notices her character in
Yeah.
verse 11.
Yeah.
Well, he replied to her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law and after the death of your husband," he noticed all that.
Yeah, yeah. And that's the thing. It's like, and that's why I go back to both people seem to be, Ruth is looking for someone to take care of her, a husband. Boaz is looking for a woman of character. And I'm glad you brought up, and that, in fact, I think that's where if I can say it this way, the love story begins. Because he sees her heart, he sees her character, and that's when he starts paying special attention to her. Although you may make the argument that a little earlier in verse 5, he looks out and goes, okay, who's that woman? Who's that? I'm going to say it this way. Who's that pretty woman out in the field? He catches our eye, but when he finds out about her character, that's when things go to the next level. I think there's just so many layers to this story. It's like pulling back an onion. And so the story continues. Yeah.
And they mentioned that this is not Ruth, the other one. That's
Esther? Orpah.
Esther's daughter-in-law is like, Esther's my relative.
Okay.
And she has, the Savior thing may have already
Yeah, okay.
gone
So,
on you.
yeah, I think you're. I mentioned Esther in there, so I think I may have thrown you off with Esther because there are some parallels. It's not Esther. There are some interesting parallels between Esther and Ruth that I'll throw out just really quickly. That neither story, God is not mentioned at all in Esther. God does not speak directly at all in Ruth. But yeah, you're Naomi, and so I messed you up there. But yeah, you're right. Yeah. So the story continues there in chapter 3. And Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, speaks again. He goes, my daughter, shouldn't I find rest for you so that you are taken care of? Naomi looks around and goes, I'm old. I don't have much time left in this world. You're my only family left. Yes, you're not genetically my family, but you're my daughter-in-law or ex-daughter-in-law. I want to make sure you're taken care of. And Boaz are relatives. And you've been working in his field. So this evening, he's going to be winnowing barley on the barley floor, the threshing floor. So go wash. Go put on perfumed oil. Go wear your best clothes. I'm going to put it in American language. Go get prettied up and get ready for a date night. Go down to the threshing floor, but don't let the man know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. And when he lies down, notice the place where he's lying and go in and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will explain to you what you should do. There's a lot of stuff and a lot of conversation about what's going on there in verse 4. I'm just put that obvious. Some people think there's a little more explicit things going on there. I want to expose you to that so you're not shocked if you come across it. But at the very least, Ruth seems to be popping the question to Boaz here. She seems to be going to Boaz there in verse 4 and really all of chapter 3 and saying, Boaz, will you marry me? Which is kind of backwards from the way we do it today. But she does that. She goes to the threshing floor. She obeys her mom and listens to everything her mother-in-law tells her to do. And so when Boaz eats, drinks, and he lies down and he's in good spirits, she came in secretly and uncovers his feet, and she lies down. And Boaz wakes up in the middle of the night, and there's a woman there that wasn't there when he went to bed. And he's a little startled, like most of us would be. And he asks, who are you? Verse 9. I am Ruth, your servant. It must have been really dark because they've already had a conversation. So it must have been so dark in there that he couldn't recognize her. And she says, I am Ruth, your servant. Take me under your wing. Didn't we read that phrase a moment ago in chapter 2? That Boaz looks to her and says, under whose wings? Under the Lord's wings you have fled for refuge. Now here in the text she goes, take me under your wing. I'm fleeing to you for refuge. You are my family redeemer. Okay. What's a family redeemer? What's a kinsman redeemer in the Old Testament?
If a man died, brother.
Yeah. Yes. And that sounds really strange to us. I don't have a brother. So I don't know what that would happen to me if something happened to me in, ancient Judaism and what Allison would have to do. But yeah, you're spot on. It's that brother who would be responsible for procreating his brother's lineage, even though his brother died an untimely death. And she's like, you're my kinsman redeemer. We're related. I need you to bring family, procreate, bring around a family in my name. And in verse 10, he says, may the Lord bless you, my daughter. You have shown more kindness now than before, because you have not pursued younger men, whether rich or poor. Don't be afraid, my daughter. I will do whatever you say, since all the people in my town know that you are a woman of noble character. This is a Moabite. This is a lady who grew up in a place where ritual prostitution and perhaps even child sacrifice, a place that was known for immorality. And yet it's in that time that everyone in Bethlehem recognizes that Moabite. She's got character. I think that's interesting. And there in verse 12, it is true that I am a family redeemer, but there is a redeemer closer than I am. Stay here tonight, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem you, that's good. Let him redeem you. But if he doesn't want to redeem you, as the Lord lives, I will. And so the next morning in chapter 4, Boaz goes to the gate of the town. That's where all the city business was handled. It's like going to the courthouse. And he goes up to the man who's the closer kinsman redeemer, and he tells him the story about this field there in chapter 4 and verse 3. That if you want it, you can redeem it, but if not, I'll redeem it. And he goes, I'll take it. It's a field. I'm going to be rich. And he goes, oh, by the way, when you redeem this field, you're also getting Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth. And he goes, never mind. I don't want more mouths to feed. And so Boaz is able to redeem it. Boaz buys the property, gets Naomi and Ruth. There in the text, they get married. In verse 13, and Ruth gets pregnant. And the women now say to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you without a family redeemer today. May his name become well known in Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. Indeed, your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better than 7 sons, has given birth to him. And Naomi took the child and placed him on her lap and became a mother to him. And the women said, a son has been born to Naomi, and they named him Obed. And he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And so let's read that genealogy in the last couple of verses. And with that in mind, as we're reading, let's keep this question in mind. How does this genealogy at the end of Ruth fit within the broader biblical narrative? Now, these are the family records of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Abinadab. Abinadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Who is Salmon? Or Salmon, depends on which way you want to pronounce it. Married Rahab. Salmon fathered Boaz. I wonder if that may be the reason Boaz was a little more open to someone who wasn't a Jew. Because his mom wasn't a native Israelite. I think that also may be speaking to the character of both Salmon and Rahab that we don't see explicitly told in the biblical text. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. Jesse fathered David. So what does this genealogy, how does it fit within the broader biblical narrative? What's the importance of David? Let me put it that way. How important is David to the biblical story? Very, very important. Like, he's top 5. He's in the Old Testament Hall of Fame, if I can put it that way. He's one of those characters that is so pivotal to the biblical story. And so here in Ruth, it explains and shows us how the family of David came. And I'm going to ask you to keep something in mind for the next couple of weeks as we work our way through 1st and 2nd Samuel. Where does David run to when he gets in trouble at one point in his life? Moab. Why do you think that is? Because he's got some family there. We'll dig into that in the next couple of weeks. Yeah, Chris?
Yeah, the book of Ruth has this perspective on God,
Yeah.
on the Lord, that I think, and I'm not going to go into all the verses that do, but it starts out with him not even being consulted, to him being the reason for all the tragedy.
Yeah.
And if you walk through the progression of when the Lord's mentioned and look at by the end of it, it's that the Lord has not left you
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
day. And that's really from her draw that the Lord has absolutely left
Yeah.
you,
Yeah.
to the Lord hasn't left us.
Yeah.
And that's a narrative then on Judges
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah. I think, and that ties into the question, how does Ruth highlight the themes of redemption and restoration? I think one of them is what Chris just said. You see the progression from the Lord has left us, the Lord has abandoned us, to the Lord has not left us. Y'all see other ways Ruth highlights it? Yes, Steve?
Not sure if this is exactly where you're going, but I sure feel parallels between this book and the book of Job. That if there's a takeaway lesson out of Job, John could teach this better than I can, but if there's a takeaway, it's keep your trust in the Lord, He will take care of you. That's the overarching thing, is with all the horrible things that happened in Job, at the end of the day, that covenant relationship is so strong that it carries the moment. And in a way, Ruth is a tragedy story.
Yeah.
But she stays faithful, and how does it work out?
God is still there, even when it doesn't look like it, even when it doesn't feel like it. And you see that in Ruth, you see it in Job, and you kind of see it in Esther too.
It's a message for us.
And that is that's one of the big messages for us. And so some of these stories, some of these books in the Bible that we look at today, I hope as we're going through our daily Bible reading, we're seeing these things maybe for the first time, maybe we're seeing again, we're being reminded of some things maybe we learned before about God and His character and His care for His people. What else do you guys see there that highlights the idea of redemption and restoration and reconciliation and all those R words? Y'all see anything else? Yeah.
Well, all of us are gonna go through this.
Yeah.
We all have partners, we all got married and had those vows and then all of a sudden, one of them dies.
Yeah.
And so we go through this whether we want to or not. But when you have God on your side, He gives you the peace and He gives you will to continue to live and to go on with your life, and He even gets you in the right direction that He wants you to go. But you have to remember that you've got to keep that relationship going.
Yeah.
You can't let it go.
Yeah.
That's one thing in life that you have to hang on to for
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
life.
Yeah. That's a great point. And so on that note, we are a little, in fact, more than a few minutes over, which I'm okay with. I hope the elders are. But on that note, we'll call class dismissed.